Hi, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss. As many of you know, my new book, The War on Science, is appearing July 29th of this year in the United States and Canada. And to celebrate that, we've interviewed many of the authors, of the 39 authors who have contributed to this volume. And we have 20 separate podcast interviews that will be airing over the next 20 days, starting July 22nd, before and after the book first appears, with many of the authors in the book on a host of different subjects. The authors we will have interviews with in order of appearance over the next 20 days are Richard Dawkins, Niall Ferguson, Nicholas Christakis, Maarten Boudry, Abigail Thompson, John Armstrong, Sally Satel, Solveig and Joshua Katz, Francis Widdowson, Carole Hooven, Janice Fiamengo, Geoff Horsman, Alessandro Strumia, Roger Cohen and Amy Wax, Peter Boghossian, Lauren Schwartz and Arthur Rousseau, Alex Byrne and Moti Gorin, Judith Sisa and Alice Sullivan, Carleen Gribble, and finally Dorian Abbott. The topics that will be discussed will range over the need for free speech and open inquiry in science and the need to preserve scientific integrity, stressed by our first podcast interviewee, Richard Dawkins, and will once again go over historical examples of how academia has been hijacked by ideology in the past and the negative consequences that have come from that, to issues of how specific disciplines, including mathematics, have been distorted, and how certain departments at universities now specifically claim that they are social activists, and a degree in their field is a degree in either critical social justice or social activism, not a degree in a specific area of scholarship, how ideology has permeated universities. We'll proceed also to discuss issues in medicine. Sally Satel will talk about how social justice has hijacked medicine. And also, when it comes to issues of gender-affirming care, we have a variety of authors who are going to speak about the issues there and how too often gender-affirming care claims are made that are not based on empirical evidence, in fact, falsely discuss the literature in ways that are harmful to young people. We'll talk to several people who, for one reason or another, have been canceled for saying things. Francis Widdowson at Mount Royal University in Canada, and Carole Hooven from Harvard, who eventually had to leave Harvard after saying on television that sex is binary in biology. We'll be talking to people who've looking at the impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion in academia and how it's restricting free inquiry and also restricting, in many ways, scientific merit at those universities. And finally, Dorian Abbott, the last contributor to our series, will be talking about 3 principles he believes are essential to separate science and politics and keep academia free from ideology and more for open questioning and progress, and to make sure that science is based on empirical evidence, and where we go where the evidence is, whether it's convenient or not, whether it's politically correct or not, and we're willing to debate all ideas that nothing is sacred, a central feature of what science should be about and what, in some sense, this podcast is about. So I hope you really enjoy the next 20 days, and we've enjoyed bringing it to you. So with no further ado, The War on Science, the interviews. Well, I'm so happy to have Joshua Katz and Solveig here together, sharing a microphone, a first for the Origins podcast, and to talk about their article for the book, The War on Science. The title of the article is called An Apology for Philology, which is also a rhyme, I just realized as I say it. But that's probably, I don't know if that entered into why you made that title. We'll get to that. But both of you, thank you very much for being here. It's nice. I've met Joshua finally for the first time just recently, but Solveig, it's the first time I've met you just virtually. But thank you for both coming on, and thank you for writing for the book. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's great to be here.
And it is great to have you. Now, the the Origins podcast is an Origins podcast, and that means I like to learn about how people got to the point of what we're talking about, and so I wanted to talk to each of you for a little while about your own origin story, and I'll start with Joshua, who most recently academic position was a Katz professor in humanities at Princeton. Your background, you studied at Yale in linguistics, and I don't know if I ever asked you. You're younger than me. When was that?
I was an undergraduate at Yale from 1987 to 1991.
Okay, so
we overlapped a little bit. I
yeah,
remember
exactly. So had you been wise, you could have taken my class on physics for poets, but you didn't.
had I been wise, I could have taken a class of physics for not poets. But
yeah.
Fortunately, part of my origin, as my wife knows, is that one of two subjects I was incompetent in was physics. I was very good at math. I was very good at chemistry. I was unbelievably bad at physics. No doubt I am unbelievably bad at physics.
It's okay. Well, that answers one of the questions I have, because I always ask people, why didn't you do physics?
Truly, nobody wants me to do physics.
But anyway, and you did linguistics. What got you interested in linguistics? It's not necessary. I mean, it's an interesting field to choose to do your undergraduate major in. A lot of people, I think, do a graduate degree in linguistics with an undergraduate in something else, because they're not wise enough to realize what it's all about early on. But what caused you to do that at Yale?
Well, I think pretty much I had that down from the age of about 5. That's probably something of an exaggeration, but it is true that I started assembling grammar books and learning funny languages from the age of 5. And by the time I was in double digits, I knew a lot of languages, particularly a lot of dead languages. And somehow or other, in fact, in part, thanks to a family friendship with Noam Chomsky, I learned that there was this subject called linguistics, and I started reading books at a very young age about linguistics. And so I can't really remember a time when I wanted to do something other than that. I just languages, in particular, I should say, the deader, the better. And so ultimately, the fact that at Princeton, I was, as you said, the Coates professor in the humanities, also a professor of classics, is not terribly surprising. The odd thing is that I was also not a professor of linguistics, but that's because Princeton, to its shame, and there are many shames to Princeton, does not have a department of linguistics. I was director of the program for a while.
Oh, I wondered about that. Okay, I wonder why you weren't a professor of linguistics. I guess I'd always thought of you as a classicist, because I don't know why, but that's what I'd always thought of you as that. And then I was surprised to learn your background was linguistics, but that is interesting. And then, in fact, traditional linguistics, being talented, as you pointed out, in mathematics is an advantage. I know Noam, as you know, probably know, as an old friend of mine, and as well, and for many years, and obviously, having tried every now and then to pour through some traditional linguistics, the logic aspect of it is very mathematical. So.
Absolutely. So I was interested in math. I was interested in philosophical logic. I was also interested in, as many linguists are, in music. And
interesting.
All of those came together. But I should say that the classicists don't believe that I'm a linguist, and the linguists don't believe that I'm a classicist. That's just what happens if you work.
I used to work at, I helped establish a field called particle astrophysics, and the particle physicists sometimes viewed me as an astrophysicist, and the astrophysicist as a particle physicist. and one of my colleagues used to just call me a half astrophysicist. Anyway, and then you did your PhD in linguistics as well. Then you went to England for a little while, right?
I did.
As a Marshall Scholar.
I was.
And then came back to Harvard to do the linguistics. And then did you move right to Princeton?
I did. I actually started at Princeton the semester before I had my PhD.
Isn't that a lucky?
You're left until, as you know, I had to leave.
Yeah, no, okay. So that was always your dominant institution. No, well, I when I was at Harvard, I was in a program called the Society of Fellows, where a lot of people sort of spent their last terms as doing their PhD, actually having faculty positions elsewhere. In physics, it never happened. It was always grinding through one or two postdocs. But it's nice when people are recognized early on, and you can do that. You did, to be sure, got canceled out of Princeton for speaking out about a subject. Ultimately, in my opinion, in your opinion, I think, for speaking out honestly about a subject having, which was this fanaticism over apparent racism at the university, apparent rather than empirical. Racism, and having the courage to speak out about it caused a real controversy, and ultimately led to the university finding an excuse to terminate you. Would you agree with that?
That is accurate.
And that's and we have a lot. I mean, in the book, we have a number of people who've been canceled who write about their experiences. And the key point is that universities will find an argument, no matter how bad, to do what they want to do, regardless of such ephemeral concepts as academic freedom or fairness or due process or anything else. And in spite of, by the way, having, as far as I know, being one of the more popular professors and teachers at the university, which I'm sure the university extremely valued until they decided that it would be more expedient not to value it. And
I think that's right. I think it's fair to say that I was one of the most popular professors at Princeton until overnight I became the least popular professor at Princeton. It happened overnight, and that's not just a metaphor. It was overnight.
That's what happens, and it's amazing how things can switch in academia. And and the fact that can happen makes it clear that things aren't based on sound reasoning, evidence, empirical argument, or discussion, which should be the basis of decision-making universities and should be the basis of all scholarship. The fact that
it's the war on science.
It's exactly it is a war on science, and your own experience is part of it. But happily, we're going to talk about another war in that you guys are both concerned about. But before we get there, I want to talk to Solveig, who I know, unlike you, was, as far as I can tell, always wedded to the class. Well, you were wedded to many things, but I know that Solveig did her undergraduate degree in Princeton in classics. I assume while you were there, and then a PhD in Cambridge, right? In classics.
That's right.
Why classics?
I fell in love with classics, well, with Latin in particular, as a child, in part because I heard a lot of it at church.
I was going to say your parents didn't speak it at home, did they?
No, unfortunately. Would that they did, but no, we, there was always Latin in the music that we listened to and at church, and I started Latin in 6th grade, and my 6th grade teacher memorably told my parents that I had a bright future in Latin, which my parents always thought was
as a dead language. They might have been concerned about it.
Yes, exactly. It was always just a subject I liked at school. Then I had a teacher who encouraged me to get into Latin recitation. And I did a number of Latin recitation contests in New York, and I was pretty successful at those. I also did some Latin dramas, Seneca's Thyestes in Latin in high school. And through that, I actually got to meet Joshua's first wife, who was very involved in that world. And she encouraged me to apply to Princeton. And at Princeton, I started taking Greek, and I was continuing with classics, but I was also flirting with other subjects. I was really interested in philosophy. But at the end of the day, I realized I could do philosophy in classics. Classics, as we talk about in our chapters, an interdisciplinary subject and allows you to do all sorts of things. So I liked that I could do philosophy and languages at the same time. I wasn't set on being an academic like Joshua was, but I met a lot of really stupid classics PhD students. And I thought, well, if these people are getting PhDs, I want to get one too, just so I can say I have one as well. And I went to Cambridge for an MPhil, thought if I liked it enough, I would stay for the PhD. I loved it, stayed. To this day, I think Cambridge Classics faculty is one of the few relatively sane places out there. So I had a wonderful few years there before returning to Princeton, where things were a lot darker.
Yes, things a lot darker. Well, that's interesting that you. I took 3 years of Latin, and I back in the days, and it's sad, as you probably know, that Latin it's amazing that you had a grade 6 class in Latin. Mine, it wasn't, the first Latin class was not till grade 9. I grew up in Canada, so we had 13 grades of high school, so a little more time. But I mean, it's something, I wish we'd had Greek, but certainly Latin was remarkable. But I think after 3 years proceeded to the point where I might have almost had a conversation for about 2 minutes, maybe, if I was lucky, but it was still amazing. It was remarkable for me to finally read, which is really what we'll get to the question of philology, and it really hit home for me, because of course I'd read, classic texts that had been in Latin, in English, and when we were able to just look at a few texts and read them in Latin and suddenly get a different perspective of what was really happening, it was an eye-opening experience for me, and a lovely one. So I can understand the attraction of really beginning to try and get your head begin to suspect what you understood what it was like to live a few thousand years ago. It's amazing to me. And of course, also to discover that the more things change, the more they stay the same in many ways, which was also for me.
When you decide to rename the podcast Origenes, you can have us back on and we'll do it in Latin and see whether you can do a couple of minutes of it.
Okay, we'll see what we can do. I must say, I can be bought, just so you know, in case that, in case you want. But it's and I want to talk about now the article, the Apology for Philology, and I have to say, some people, the book is called The War on Science. Why have an article like this? And we've talked about it. I've talked about with the publisher. There are a number of reasons, but science to me is sort of reason and empiricism and critical inquiry, real critical inquiry, and that's all that science is. And what you're talking about is, in many ways, is just that. But also, classics, I tend to think of it as the basis of philosophy, which is the basis of science in many ways. And so it's a natural, the fact that a discipline that explores the earliest inklings of critical analysis and also poetry and creativity itself is being attacked is really a fundamental attack of the basic scholarship on which all of academia and science as well is based. So it's perfectly reasonable to me, and I'm happy you're a part of it. Now,
I mean, basically, the war on science is a war on evidence-based inquiry and research, and there's a chapter about evidence.
It is exactly, and exactly. And so let's go there. Let me read the first paragraph or actually part of the first paragraph of your piece, which opens with a shocker. I mean, just an amazing shocker. In a bid to increase enrollment, especially of students of color, the Princeton Department of Classics in the spring of 2021 made the now infamous decision to eliminate its language requirement for undergraduate majors so that students could graduate with a degree in classics without ever taking a single course in Latin or Greek. And he says, the linguist John McWhorter put it, the Princeton Classics Department's new position is tantamount to saying that Latin and Greek are too hard to require Black students to learn them. The decision often have people scratching their heads. What does it mean to do classics without the languages? And I have no idea. What the heck does it mean to do classics without the languages? I mean, can you imagine, other than the argument about the argument that disparages or demeans certain people, other than that, is there any good argument for how you can do classics without the languages?
I think it's very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
You can. The fact is that the languages have always been considered central to all the many interdisciplinary parts of classics. So you might say, well, gee, maybe you don't have to know the languages if you're a classical archaeologist. But then you remember that archaeologists do things like dig up inscriptions.
Yeah.
And then you think, well, gee, maybe you better know them. Or, well, maybe you don't need to know the languages if you're interested in philosophy. But then, of course, that's crazy because philosophy is all about the nuances of words, right?
Yeah.
How are you going to make that work if you don't know what the original, what the
Sure.
so-called original looks like. And we can go through all the subfields of classics, and sure, some of them are more linguistic-y, or more language-oriented, or more philological than others. But ultimately, boy, it's really hard to do it if you have no linguistic skills whatsoever.
Okay, now
It also means that
good. I figured you might add something. Go on.
no, it means that classics as a discipline then has no, unifying theme. I mean, there's no reason that the ancient historians have to be in a classics department. They could be in a history department, right? There's no reason that the classical archaeologists need to be within the umbrella of classics. There's no reason that the classical art historians shouldn't just be in an art history department, or the ancient philosophers be in a philosophy department. All of these people could be in disparate departments, but we have decided that there is a benefit to having an interdisciplinary subject called classics. But the only thing that makes that discipline cohesive is if there is a certain set body of knowledge that all those people share. And what that knowledge has always been has been the languages, and specifically the methodology known as philology.
Well, okay, now you've made a great segue to what I was going to ask the next question, which is the title of the article isn't an apology for classics. It's called an apology for philology. So
Right.
what is, as you asked the question yourself in the article, what is classical philology? Feel free.
Well, so let's start with philology itself. So classical philology is philology of the so-called classical languages, which for the purposes of this conversation, let's call ancient Greek and Latin. And if you want to talk about what that means, of course, we can do that. The term philology is problematic, if I can use an adjective that has all sorts of connotations that one doesn't really want these days. But it's problematic because many different people over many centuries and in different countries have used it in different ways. But if I may quote ourselves in the article, we start on the first page with what we consider the definition to be, or at least the definition for the purposes of this article. And I'm just going to read that, and we can talk about that if you want.
I would have read it if you hadn't, so that's good.
Sure, I'll read it, right? So philology, as we were trained to do it, in fact, we write classical philology, but then again, as I said, that's philology of the classics. Philology, as we were trained to do it, is the attempt to understand a text as it was produced in its historical context, with as few anachronistic preconceptions as possible. So to put bluntly, philology is the art of reading carefully.
Reading carefully. And you say, in fact, that so central was philology to the discipline of classics that the Society for Classical Studies, which is the main learned society from 1869 to 2014, was called the American Philological Association.
Exactly. It was called the American Philological Association, and there was a big debate about whether to change the name. It was a very close vote, but ultimately the name was changed to the Society for Classical Studies. To be fair, there's nothing terribly wrong with being called the Society for Classical Studies, except, very amusingly, that now people are worried about the word classical, because after all, what about classical Chinese? What about classical Maya? What about classical music? What about Shakespeare as a classics? And so on. And besides, what is a classic? So in fact, there's a real mess here. Basically,
absolutely. It's clearly a supremacist concept. Anyway, but as you point out, philology is no longer the core of classics, and it's been replaced by a form of activist teaching and research, bolstered by $1 million grant.
Yes.
To two professors, one at Brown and one at Princeton, for their initiative Racing in the Classics, which I originally would have thought, okay, let's read them quickly. But that prizes such concerns as identity, race, gender, etc., politics, and the environment. And I want to quote this before we go on next. I mean, I love some of these quotes, amaze me, from this book, Critical Ancient World Studies, The Case for Forgetting Classics. Critiques the field's Eurocentrism and refuses to inherit silently a field crafted so as to constitute a mythical prehistory for the imagined West. It rejects the assumption of an axiomatic relationship between so-called classics and cultural value. It denies positivist accounts of history and all modes of investigation that aim at establishing a perspective that is neutral or transparent, and commits instead to showcasing the contingency of history and historiography in a way that is alert to the injustices and epistemologies of power that have shaped the way certain kinds of knowledge have been constructed as, quote, objective within the discipline known as classics. It requires those who participate in it a commitment to decolonizing the gaze of and at antiquity. These buzzwords of decolonization and the idea of that certain kinds of knowledge are constructed, which is really central to many things in this book. The attack on knowledge itself as if it's ephemeral, and frankly, which as I've often alluded to when I taught at Yale on what's called Science Hill, which very few people ever went up to at Yale, where the science departments were. We used to look down at the deconstructionists in the English department and who talked like that, and we said it can never happen here, but it has.
I just want to add one thing, and that is that as you said, this quotation is from a book whose subtitle is The Case for Forgetting Classics. And it's important to note that the editors, and at least the vast majority of contributors to it, are themselves classicists or credentialed classicists or people who work in classics departments. So this is a very remarkable thing. It's not that the core is now this rather than philology. It's that there's kind of no core anymore because so many people who are inside the discipline are convinced that the discipline must be destroyed. They, of course, don't want to lose their jobs themselves.
Well, right. And they sit in the comfort of their, tenured positions or tenured track positions at nice elite universities, while at less elite universities, classics departments are getting slashed left and right. So there are plenty of people who deserve their positions, who for whom there are no positions left, and these people can sit comfortably in their positions and talk about why we need to forget the discipline altogether.
Well, it's a really good point, because that title was Forgetting Classics, but there's another quote here which breaks me up. This is now not something about forgetting classics. It's an analysis of classical texts, and I'll read it, and I'll try not to laugh. Through a combination of Audre Lorde's Black Queer lens and Paul Presidiado's, I think I've got that right, maybe not, trans scholarship on the dildo, I further argue that by imagining simulus as Black, queer, and or trans, the power imbalance between simulus and is it Sibali? Is greatly reduced. I mean, just balderdash, and that's classics now, right? I mean, that's
right. So the point we're making here is that you either have people not doing classics and instead just spending all their time talking about classics and why we need to forget about classics, or you have people doing classics where doing classics looks like that
means trans scholarship on the dildo.
Right.
Yeah,
a phrase that I never expected to speak in any context, much less on a podcast.
Yeah, I know. It's amazing that put those words together. If you'd asked a random generator to do that with the English language, it would have taken a long time. But now the bulk of the rest of the article is really about the attack on philology and the different arguments against it. And the first one you point out is philology's racist paths. So why don't you address it and then address the obvious argument why that's not a problem? But okay.
Right. So, well, I should say for starters that we had a lot of fun reconstructing the arguments against philology because, as you can tell, even just from the quotes you've already read, the way these scholars write is complete gibberish. It's just word salad upon word salad. So, there are all of these articles that are cited over and over again as the seminal articles on, what's wrong with classics and why classics needs to die a quick, painful death. And yet when you actually sit down and read these articles, as we did, you find that there is no kind of clear argumentation and they're not making obvious claims. And so we had to really reconstruct their arguments against philology in order to then produce this counter argument. So we've broken their arguments down into three. As you say, the first is the fact that philology has a racist past. Philology was practiced by people who were slaveholders, imperialists. Sure. So was every other academic discipline, every valuable field of inquiry. This is not really an interesting criticism of any field unless you can prove that for some reason the field itself is intrinsically racist, that you cannot possibly separate the field from its racist past. And they do try to make that point as well.
And that brings us to point two, whether you want to go on.
But before you get to point two,
Yeah.
you just reminded me of something to show I have some classical background. When I guess I read, I think it's Plutarch's Lives, and when I was young, and I loved his ancient history, I still do. One of the things that shocked me at the time was one of the examples again of learning how what you think is normal is not normal necessarily. It's not normal not time invariant anyway. And in a time of celebrity, it was a real eye opener for me when I was a young person in high school, I guess, to learn that at least at certain times, in Rome at least, and Greece, I suppose, but there was a huge separation between the art and the artist. That in some ways they viewed the artist or the writer as just a portal for divine influence, but not necessarily themselves to be revered, their work to be loved. And it was a shock to me, and I thought, wow, that's really fascinating. But and what we're seeing here with this fallacious passing is of course it's kind of ironic because it's the opposite, right? Somehow you can't read anyone unless you find out if they're a good father or husband or whatever, and instead of listening to what they say, it's a remarkable argument that somehow, unless you like someone, then what they say is not worth reading, and it's just shocking, but new, and that's your argument against racism is against the silliness of this argument about its racist past is clear. But I know Geoff was eager to talk about the second thing, which is
I'm eager to talk about anything. Can I just say, though, on the first point again, there are scholars right now who are considered beyond the pale, not just me. And we know that there are classicists out there who will not cite them as a result of this, right? They will do anything possible not to cite them, even when there is no possible way that they could legitimately get away without citing them. But in fact, you can't cite somebody who's a bad person. I mean, never mind that often these bad people are good people, but the idea that you cannot cite somebody's important work, which in any other context would be considered an academic violation not to cite. The fact that you can do that is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we'll connect this because I just finished talking to Alex Byrne and Moti Gorin about gender arguments in philosophy and bioethics. And there people overtly state in the literature, we are not going to cite these people because we don't like them, basically. And it's shocking. It's shocking that could get through a journal and be accepted in their peer review. And
perhaps most sinister of all, we know of cases of people just scrubbing certain scholars from their acknowledgments. So, scholars who actively helped a student publish, or write their dissertation, and then from the finished manuscript to get the scholars entirely purged.
Yeah, and it verges on plagiarism in the sense of if you're talking about an idea that's been debated and you don't cite people who've made important contributions, you could argue that's plagiarism. It's certainly not proper scholarship anyway.
Right.
By the way, that's why I like physics, because you don't have to cite anyone if you're Richard Feynman. Anyway, but the next argument is its intrinsic whiteness, and you quote this guy Rankin from 2019, which again I will read the quote because it's so remarkable to me. The race-neutral colorblind position was simply an unconscious strategy of concealment, that is, repressing the Oedipal secret of your identity, which is hidden in plain sight, and it might never occur to you that your ability to read and write about Euripides, unimpeded by anything but the text, manuscripts, and your outstanding philological training, owes to your racial identity your whiteness. And so somehow whiteness makes the field not real. So I'll turn it over to you.
That's right. So philology is supposed to be the closest you could get to a scientific exercise in the humanities. The goal is objectivity, right? That you are trying to analyze a text with as few anachronistic preconceptions as possible. You're looking at, some ancient text, you're looking at the words of that text and you're saying, okay, well, I would translate this word this way, but, maybe I'm translating this as, equality when that's not what is actually meant here, and I'm bringing to this word a whole baggage worth of 2,000 years of baggage to the word equality that is meant by Aristotle. So you're supposed to be looking at the words as objectively as possible without all the historical baggage. What Rankin and his friends are saying is that it's that we are so embedded in our culture of whiteness that we don't realize that this objectivity doesn't exist. We think we're being objective when really everything we do is colored by our whiteness. Right.
And there is, and this is very important to stress, absolutely no evidence in Rankin's papers for this.
Right.
It's merely asserted, and as we discuss in the chapter, he has a few comments, one of which is not, in fact, even a passing comment in favor of his assertion. And these comments are, if you look at them carefully and follow the sources, complete nonsense. So I suppose in principle, one could imagine that a reading of Euripides, he talks about Euripides, a reading of Euripides might be colored by whiteness. I mean, I don't know what it would mean, but I'm willing to entertain the possibility that that could be a real thing. But neither Rankin nor anyone else, to my knowledge, has ever demonstrated anything that comes even close to this.
And yet, Rankin's article is treated as gospel by all the other scholars. So, Rankin is able to, I don't know if you want to get into the specific examples that he gives, but, Rankin has a couple of footnotes where he says, well, here's this scholar, here's this example of racism, here's this example of racism. That's all he gives, just this couple of footnotes that Joshua alluded to. Then he publishes this article, and then this article is cited over and over again by scholars throughout the field of classics as evidence that philology is indeed intrinsically white and therefore intrinsically racist. And this is what Peter Boghossian would call ideal laundering.
Certainly a variation on ideal laundering.
Yeah, you take this really flimsy argument, and all of a sudden the entire field is willing to buy that.
It is interesting how what happens is someone makes a claim and then someone quotes that claim and then someone quotes the quote of the claim, and there's a lot of citations.
Right.
And again,
what? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt that.
Well, I was just going to say again, to connect this, the interesting thing about gender affirming care is the claim that it somehow reduces suicides. And as we just discussed recently with Alex and Moti, there's really no evidence. All the articles that are supposedly cited don't say anything about it, and therefore all you get are citations with people making that claim, including all the way up at the last Biden administration. But anyway, go on.
Here's what I want people to take away from this chapter and from this podcast. You may not care at all about classics, but as we said at the beginning, philology is about reading carefully. And what we try to show in this chapter is that the scholars who are writing stuff are themselves extremely bad readers. And then there are readers of them who are extremely bad readers and don't go and check anything. And then readers of the, as you just pointed, readers of the readers of the readers. And so these various ideas that are perhaps nonsense, or at the very least have no obvious pieces of evidence behind them, just get recycled and continued and treated as gospel. So the point of philology here is not that you have to care about what Plato said or what Homer said or what Cicero
So
said.
you should.
Maybe you should, but that's not the point. The point is that at every level, whether we're talking about the 8th century BC or the 8th century of this era or of the year 2025, the critical point to understand is you got to be able to read carefully in order to make an argument, and people aren't doing it.
Exactly. And, you point out, I mean, just to drive this point home a little more carefully, I used to study history. And so it's obvious when you talk about history, it's obvious that historians see the past influenced by the present. And the point is to work very, very hard to first of all acknowledge that and to try and overcome it, to try and be as objective as possible and recognize the realities. And your whole point, I think, is that good philology, you say it, forces us to acknowledge precisely the biases that it that Rankin seems to believe it actively conceals. Namely, anyone like yourselves will know that when you read Latin or Greek, you're going to project onto it, and you try and accept that, and even probably reference it in your work. And the whole point of it is to not ignore it, but to ask how it might be impacting on your ideas. I would think it's central. Rather than concealing, I would think it would be central to good philology, as you talk about, not bad philology. And I think that's an incredibly important point. And then you give an example, and there are lots of things, and I encourage people to read this. But I was surprised. There's one example that I want to go into, which you talk about, where where Rankin misrepresents his source in, as you say, an act of intellectual sloppiness or dishonesty. You don't argue either. But I'll just start it, and then I'll let you go on. You say Rankin's argument, I'm not going to read what he said, as we understand it, is that 19th century grammar books translated service, or servus, I was going to say, I know I'm saying it wrong, servus, slave, as servant, which allowed students to read about the ancient world without having to confront the reality of slavery in their own time. And then I'll ask you to elaborate on this, but you say there's no mention, however, of anyone nowadays teaching servus or servus, I don't know, whatever, as servant. More important, though, there's scarcely any mention of servus being translated as servant in the 19th century. So the whole point is not there. So you want to elaborate?
Yeah, you take that one.
Yeah, I mean, this was really fun to discover this, because we were reading Rankin's article, and I said, you know what, let's just check these footnotes. And we checked them, and we could not believe what we found. Namely, he claims that this article, it was at the time unpublished, it's now published, so you can see the article, but he claims that the article says all these things about the translation of servus as servant, and how this had an impact on people during the time of slavery, and how that has an impact on students today. And then we look at the article, and in fact, the only mention of servus as servant is in passing, and it's the book that McCloskey, the author of the article, is talking about, uses both slave and servant interchangeably. There's no strong emphasis on servant. And more importantly, McCloskey's whole point is that these books from the 19th century were actually much better about discussing the realities of slavery than our books are today.
And that one book was, in fact, an abolitionist book.
It was an abolitionist book. That's right. So, the idea that, that this is somehow embedded in philology, from the early days, that servus should be talking about servants rather than slaves, and that we're trying to obfuscate the realities of slavery. It's complete nonsense, and there's no evidence for it. And he also provides no evidence of this going on today. So we're willing to buy that maybe there are such examples, but he hasn't cited them.
And now
that there are.
Right? There might be examples then,
yeah,
but he certainly doesn't cite them, and she doesn't cite them, and her article is entirely about that. And he doesn't cite any examples now. So sure, as Solveig just said, maybe there's an argument here to be made, but there's not so much as a hint of that argument.
And the other aspect, by the way, which we glossed over a little bit, which you say in your piece just before this, which I think is not only, there aren't examples necessarily of white supremacist misreadings of Euripides, but I think it's an important point. We don't see evidence that even that the impossibility of fully unracing ourselves actually does have a significant impact on philological scholarship, namely that this central issue that somehow we're governed by whiteness or race, that if there's no clear evidence that working to unwhiten ourselves or whatever, depending upon our race, makes any difference.
Yeah.
And I don't think they give an example, or at least if they do, it seemed, I don't know, do they?
No, I mean, they don't. And one of the odd things here, too, is that, in fact, this is about language learning books. This isn't even really an example of philology. So if the concern is, that the method of philology, which is, a scholarly method used to produce original research, that method is implicated, not only is this example a bad example, it's also just not even an example of philology. And the same is true of the other example he cites as well, which is an example of anthropology being used in classics, not of the philological method. And I think we found this again and again in these articles that we were looking at, that the scholars seem to use philology to talk about all sorts of things within the field of classics, and most specifically
philology
talk about
is bad.
Yeah, exactly.
Philology equals bad. You see the word philology, bad.
And they were saying, it was a lot about language learning, and not actually about the practice of philology. And I mean, when you see the kind of work that Rankin himself does as a philologist, you think, well, maybe he doesn't actually understand what philology is or is supposed to be, because I guess this is how he writes about it, and this is how he practices it. But it's odd, and again, it's kind of shocking that the seminal piece on the evils of philology could have such poor support.
Well, now we've burned that bridge. Let's go to philology's weaponization, which is the last thing you talk about, and an important aspect, which is hitting many fields, not just philology. Even mathematics, which always amazes me. But the idea that philology, quote, pretends to be neutral and disinvested, the test of intelligence, is associated with ideas like merit, rigor, and excellence, which are equated with white supremacy or whatever. And you quote Eccleston and your, I guess, former colleague Padilla Peralta: the presumptive rigor of philology functioned as much more than a mode or metonym of exclusionary elitism throughout the field. Institutional gatekeepers levied it as a slur that effectively sidelined black or brown-centered methodologies, especially in reception studies, as me-search. The idea that somehow merit, rigor, and excellence equaled bad. And we want to add to that at all?
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say that the first real sign that something was afoul in the Princeton Classics department came in 2018.
The very beginning of 2018.
Yes, when the faculty was trying to develop a new mission statement. This is not, in fact, my story to tell. Joshua should tell this story.
Well, the short version of this story is that in late 2017, early 2018, my colleagues decided to create a new mission statement for the Department of Classics. I was fortunately on leave, so I didn't have much to do with this, but a draft was circulated, and I made the mistake of writing to everybody in the department about this draft and saying that it seemed to me a little bit odd that we weren't saying anything about excellence. We were saying what sorts of students we wanted, but there was no indication from it that we wanted students who were good, who were actually excellent at what they were doing, or that we wanted to train students to be good, to be excellent. Right. And unfortunately, I used the word excellence, the result of which is that a few of my then now former colleagues started writing to everybody about how I was clearly a crypto-fascist, or maybe drop the crypto.
No, it wasn't that bad.
It was really bad. It became really bad really quickly, because, of course, how could I not understand that using a word like excellence was a sign that it was a dog whistle, and that word was used because, of course, that means white supremacy. That's when you know this game is over. So we call the third point in our chapter of philology's weaponization. It's a weaponization against things like merit and excellence, and a weaponization in favor of, well, I don't know what you're going to call it, anti-merit,
Yeah, anti-merit.
anti-excellence. I mean, I don't think
I think people call it equity now.
Yeah, equity, if you like,
Yeah,
word that
equal
should not be used outside economics.
Yeah. Well, as we'll get now here, I'm going to give you guys the last word in a way. I'm going to read some of the last words of your piece, and then ask you to comment. But I'll read it because I like it anyway. We are apologists for philology, but we do not believe that philology is the only worthy way to do classics. We would, however, like to see excellence across the board. This means maintaining high standards in both language instruction and scholarship. Students should be competent in Greek and Latin, and scholars at all levels should be expected to marshal correctly cited evidence creatively to make valid and ideally also sound arguments in a comprehensible way. This comprehensibility matters precisely because it is what makes the scholarship accessible to non-specialists. That is to say, what makes it not exclusionary or elitist. Still, no, not everyone can do it. Excellence necessarily excludes. And this, what amazed when I was reading this just now, it hadn't hit me before, but except for maybe the last sentence where people wouldn't have said that statement could have been the statement you'd read about in a university handbook about the fields, about what you're trying to do, and the idea that statement could be controversial is the problem, it seems to me.
Of course, but I don't think the last sentence is odd either.
I think it's absolutely right, but I don't know.
With physics, there is no way that I could have been an excellent physicist.
No, there's no way. Look, what I mean by that is it was obvious but implicit. I don't think you would have read in the handbook that, by the way, we don't want you because you're not good enough. But that was inherent. I mean, universities are not democracies; they're meritocracies, or they should be. And excellence means, you were excellence, and not everyone is excellent at everything. There are very few people who are, and I'm not sure anyone is. I'm sure no one is excellent at everything, and so it is necessarily exclusionary. I just meant it wouldn't have been something you would have proclaimed. Right. It would have just been implicit. Right. But
it's fine to be a student and an undergraduate student in a subject and not be excellent. But you should not be told, oh, well, actually, you're really great if you're not. And probably more to the point here, the job of instructors is to try to make you better. And by saying, for example, that you don't have to know the core stuff in a given field, well, then, of course, the people aren't going to be better, much less excellent.
It's a disservice to them. And so I think what your argument is, your apology for is to say, if these are going to be scholarly fields, they have to be scholarly. And the same is true for science, classics, any field of study. And and by the way, I mean, to be fair, I should also say that, excellence arises in many different ways, in many surprising ways. And I know in physics, Nobel Prize winners who were not the best mathematician in their class, but they had some other skill that came out. And so, students should realize that they don't have to be the best in one thing to be good. A lot of it is hard work and finding the areas where you are excellent. But if you're not given the opportunity or encouragement to explore the areas in which you might excel, you're not doing yourself or anyone else any service. And the university is not doing any service in educating you. In fact, it's not educating you at all. And
correct.
Well, I don't want to have the last word. I tried to summarize what you say, but if you want to add anything else now, it's I think a very important piece, and I do appreciate. I always learn from these things, but I really appreciate the importance, because again, classics is the basis at some level, in my opinion, of all subsequent knowledge. And if you're hitting the basis of it, then at least. Yeah, well, all subsequent knowledge in the West, and anyway, so.
And our argument would be that philology is the core of classics, which you have just called a certain kind of core. But I want to re-emphasize a sentence of ours that you quoted. We write, "We are apologists for philology, but we do not believe that philology is the only worthy way to do classics." unquestionably, people are going to say, well, of course, Katz and Gold are interested in philology because they're philologists. Of course, they're going to piss on all the other forms of doing classics. So I want to make very clear that that is something we are explicitly not doing, because people are going to accuse us of doing this. The fact is that we believe that philology is central. But another fact
is, I do believe it's better, but that's
well.
You're allowed to believe it.
Who knows? But the fact is, it is central, and so therefore, in some sense, I don't know if I want to use the word better, but extraordinarily important. But I'm not now going to claim that people who specialize extremely well in other forms of classics should actually become philologists. Of course they shouldn't. They should find the thing that they can do best. But not knowing any Latin, not knowing any Greek, not knowing, say, anything aside from English of the 21st century, that's just indefensible.
Well, that's a wonderful way to summarize this, and I've really enjoyed the discussion. I knew I would. I wasn't worried about that. But I thank you for contributing to the book, and I thank you for coming on here and having this fun discussion. It was a real pleasure, and I hope to, at some point in the future, meet both of you in a three-dimensional world, and instead of a two-dimensional one.
That'll be great. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, it's Lawrence again. As the Origins podcast continues to reach millions of people around the world, I just wanted to say thank you. It's because of your support, whether you listen or watch, that we're able to help enrich the perspective of listeners by providing access to the people and ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world and driving the future of our society in the 21st century. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also leave us private feedback on our website if you'd like to see any parts of the podcast improved. Finally, if you'd like to access ad-free and bonus content, become a paid subscriber at originsproject.org. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation as a non-profit effort committed to enhancing public literacy and engagement with the world by connecting science and culture. You can learn more about our events, our travel excursions, and ways to get involved at originsproject.org. Thank you.